Hey everyone, welcome back to Bunny Call. Last time, we had the first part, and it was a bit slow at first, but I'm thinking that this time things are going to ramp up. Just like last time when we did the Step Closer audiobook, I will say I have had almost no spoilers, so I'm going into this blind. That being said, I'll try to keep my reactions, to a minimum. But if I seem surprised at some things, it's probably because I am. Anyway, let's continue. By the way, if you've gotten this far, maybe make it a habit to subscribe, because, if you don't subscribe, well, what if you miss the next part when it comes out? That would be bad. So, maybe that would be a good thing to do, purely for your benefit. It wouldn't help me at all. Anyway, where were we? So, Bob was about to... Okay, so yeah, remember Bob? He's grumpy, real grumpy, and they were about to... I think they had finished their first day at camp, and now his daughter is asking for a bedtime story. So nothing much has happened so far. Really the only thing that'll probably be relevant in the end, is that he signed their family up for this thing called a bunny call, without them knowing. But I don't know why I'm telling you that, guys. You were here for the last part, but I don't know, just to catch you up, I guess. Okay, Bob sat with his back against the metal frame of the double daybed. He was pretty sure the frame, in a previous life, had been a medieval torture device. It managed to attack both his spine and his kidneys at the same time. Bob wrapped his arms around Cindy and tried not to inhale her smoky scent. Normally, Cindy smelled like strawberries and vanilla at night. The strawberry scent was from her shampoo, and the vanilla was from the warm vanilla almond milk she liked to drink before bed. Wanda decided to skip the kids' bath time tonight because the day had been so long, and Cindy was already feeling bloopy from too many swallows to make room for her usual before-bed treat. Bob watched Wanda open the window on the far side of the cabin. She was fanatical about having fresh air in the evening, no matter how cold it was outside. At least it wasn't that frigid tonight. Wanda crossed the cabin, pulled back the covers, and slid in next to Bob. She looked at her daughter. "Okay, what story are we doing tonight?" she asked Cindy. This was the routine. Bob held his daughter, and Wanda told the story. Bob could design and even build houses, but he couldn't put together a story to save his life. Wanda was the storyteller. "Caterpillar!" Cindy shrieked, pretty much right into Bob's ear. He cringed, but didn't push her away. "Okay." Wanda leaned over and kissed the top of Cindy's head. She sneezed, then nestled close to Bob, laying her head on his shoulder. From there, she began to tell a convoluted story about a caterpillar who built his cocoon all wrong and had to redo it so he could become a butterfly. At one point, Bob was tempted to insert a couple architectural details regarding the building process, but he wisely remained silent. At the beginning of Wanda's story, Cindy kept piping up with her opinion about how things should go. Every time she did, she squirmed and ended up elbowing Bob in some sensitive area of his anatomy. It was like trying to cuddle with a small kangaroo. Bob wasn't a huge fan of the experience. But about 5 minutes in, she closed her eyes, and her body went limp. This was the part of the night Bob did like. In fact, he pretty much loved it. When Cindy relaxed, her sweet toddler Pudge filled Bob's arms with pillowy, warm softness, and then holding her was one of the most sweet and comforting things in the world. Sometimes it was so comforting he forgot who he was, and what he had to do the next day. He forgot to be overwhelmed and angry and resentful. It took him back to his childhood, to memories of snuggling his well-worn teddy bear. "Earplugs," Wanda whispered, holding them out. Bob took the earplugs and gently inserted them in Cindy's ears, while Wanda took care of her own. She gave Bob a kiss on the cheek, put her sleep mask on, and said good night, as she curled onto her side next to him. Wanda and Cindy started to snore almost simultaneously. Cindy's first whirring blat landed in the same ear she'd shrieked into a few minutes before. This time Bob shifted Cindy in his arms, but he didn't immediately transfer her to the trundle bed. He just sat there, holding his daughter and listening to his family's rumbling snores. Beyond the snores, the noises of the nighttime forest reached out to Bob's senses. That, combined with the tender sweetness of his family snuggling close, eased the remaining tension in his body. Nighttime in the forest was actually one of the things he'd been okay with about this trip. He remembered lying in his sleeping bag next to his dad, under the stars, listening to the crickets. Ever since then, nature's night sounds had soothed him. Bob tried to hear the crickets now, but all he could hear were Cindy's little popping splurt flibs in his ears. That was okay, too. Wait, was that an owl? Bob listened hard. Yes, an owl hooted, not too far from the cabin. Bob's dad, a nature and animal lover, was interested in animal symbolism. He'd taught Bob that owls were often seen as harbingers of death, but they could also be portents of renewal and rebirth. What message did this owl have for Bob? Bob didn't know, but he did know that for these cherished moments holding Cindy, he could convince himself that he had good things in his life. He could talk himself into the all-is-well mentality Wanda lived out every day. Suddenly, Bob stiffened. The image of an orange bunny with a white and black checked vest flitted through his mind. Ralpho. "Oh man," Bob whispered. How could he have signed up his family for such a cruel prank? It was probably going to traumatize Cindy for life. Listening to the snoring concert going on around him, Bob thought about how upset his wife and kids always were when they were awakened abruptly. Doing that on purpose wasn't the nicest thing in the world. No, tell the truth, Bob, he berated himself. The truth was that signing up his family for the Bunny Call was crew. What had he been thinking? He'd been thinking about himself. Now he thought about his peacefully sleeping wife and kids. However put upon he might feel about this trip, taking it out on them wasn't justice at all. It was selfish and childish. He sighed. Well, it was too late now. Hopefully the Bunny Call wouldn't be so bad. Bob inched away from his wife and carefully placed Cindy in the trundle bed. Then he put in his own earplugs and lay back on his pillow. In spite of his exhaustion, he lay there a long time before he fell asleep. Bob sat up in bed and clawed at his earplugs. Digging them frantically from his ears, he felt his heart hammer against his ribcage like it was desperate to get out. Sweat glued his gray t-shirt and boxer shorts to his body. What in the world? Usually Bob didn't sleep all that well, but he wasn't prone to panic attacks or night sweats. So what woke him up? He looked around the cabin. Was everything okay? It seemed to be. His wife and kids were snoring in a strangely endearing harmony of buzzing and honking tones. The doors were closed, but through the open window, he could still hear the peaceful sounds to which he'd fallen asleep. Nothing appeared to be amiss. Bob tried to calm his breathing, but it wouldn't slow down. He concentrated to try and remember what he'd been dreaming before Ralpho. That was what he'd been dreaming about. He'd been dreaming about Ralpho. Obviously, his guilt had followed him into his sleep. Bob took a deep breath and got out of bed. He grabbed the penlight on his keyring. Bob used his penlight to find safe passage past the end of the trundle bed, and then a few feet across the floor to the bathroom. There, he closed the door and turned on the light over the sink. He looked at himself in the mirror. Still the same Bob. Or was he? This Bob looked a little feral. His eyes were bloodshot, and his hair stuck out. His mouth was stretched into a wide grimace. This Bob looked like he'd made a deal with the devil. Had he? Bob snorted and shook his head. He noticed his eyebrows were getting too bushy. In the last year or so, Bob had started losing hair on top of his head, and he'd started growing hair where he didn't want any extra. How was that fair? Forget fair. What purpose did it serve? Leaning over the sink, Bob ran cool water and splashed his face. While his family continued to snore, he thought about Ralpho again. He looked at his watch. It was 11:50 p.m. He'd barely slept before he woke up. This did not bode well for a good night's sleep. Just over 5 hours before Ralpho would show up. Could Bob call it off? If he could, how would he do it? Were the camp counselors available during the night? Yes, he remembered. The cabins had no phones, and Camp Britannia had no cell phone coverage, but an idle flip through the rulebook had revealed that every cabin was equipped with a large bell you could use to signal for help in case of an emergency. Bob didn't think this was a bell-ringing emergency. In fact, he was pretty sure if he rang a bell to cancel the Bunny Call, they'd kick him out of the camp. Then again, Bob shook his head. He wasn't going to humiliate his family by ringing an emergency bell to cancel a prank, even if it might get him out of this so-called vacation. Besides, if he did that, they'd know what he'd set up. Bob leaned over the sink again and slurped some water. Straightening and wiping his mouth, he decided he was making way too much out of a silly prank. Ralpho was just some kid in a rabbit suit, right? All Ralpho would do was scare the kids a little, probably annoy his wife, and that would be that. No big deal. Wasn't part of parenting getting his kids ready for the big bad world? If they could be undone by a noisy orange rabbit, how did they have any hope of surviving real-world battles like those Bob faced every day? Bob nodded at himself in the mirror, and turned off the bathroom light. He'd convinced himself that the Bunny Call would be good for his kids. Bob was doing his kids a favor. And Wanda? Well, Wanda was a big girl. She could handle it. And if not, well, she did drag him to this absurd place. A little payback wouldn't be so bad, would it? Bob nodded again and headed back to bed. Bob lay on his side in the dark. How much time had passed since the last time he'd checked? He pressed the button on the side of his watch, and the tiny light revealed digital numbers informing him a mere 19 minutes had passed since he last compulsively checked the time. And before that 19 minutes it had been 23 minutes. Before that it had been 33 minutes. Before that it was 37 minutes. Before that it was 49 minutes. If he kept up this pattern, he'd be waking up every couple minutes within the next half hour. Approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes of thrashing in the bed and opening his eyes to check his watch. What a great night Bob was having. Apparently he didn't believe all his rational arguments in favor of the bunny call. Bob closed his eyes and tried to go back to sleep. Sure enough, the next time he looked at his watch, 13 minutes had passed. Then 7, and now 3. It was getting close to 3 a.m., 2 more hours. 1.5 hours, 1 hour, a half hour, 15 minutes, 5 minutes. His eyes felt like something had been trying to scrape its way out through his irises all night long. Bob looked around the cabin, but he only saw a whole lot of blackness. At home, the house was never this dark. Their home had exterior lights, and the subdivision had street lights. Camp Britannia's cabins didn't have exterior lights because, according to the camp brochure, that would ruin the nature experience. Wanda had brought a nightlight from home, but the boys refused to let her plug it in. "It'll ruin the experience, Mom," they'd said in unison before laughing uproariously. And so Cabin Nutta was nothing but a featureless void. If it wasn't for the sound of his family's snores, Bob could have convinced himself he was alone in a vacuum. Bob held very still and listened. Was Ralpho on the move? Was he out there someplace? Was he right outside the cabin? Bob felt his arm hairs stand up and quiver in the dark. "Wuss," he whispered. He wished he could hear something other than snoring. Ralpho could be right outside the door, and Bob wouldn't know it until the door started to open. Bob fumbled for his pen light and aimed it at the cabin door. He let out his breath. Okay, good. He could see what was coming now. So, now what? Should he just wait here for Ralpho to burst in and scare his family half to death? What kind of dad did that? Bob threw back the covers and got up. Wanda snorted and turned over. Cindy made a noise that sounded like a chortle. Bob shone his light at the door again. Should he check outside? Yes, you idiot, he told himself. Standing here in the dark wasn't accomplishing anything. Bob crossed to the chest of drawers between the bed and the window on the right side of the cabin. He felt around in the top drawer for a pair of sweats. Finding them, he pulled them on. Then he went to the cabin door and slipped on the sandals that were nearly lined up with a row of smaller sandals against the wall. He opened the door, tensing because he half expected to be smacked upside the head with a cymbal. But the cabin's small porch was empty. Bob looked out at the blackness that surrounded Cabin Nutta. He glanced up at the sky. No moon, no stars. Apparently the clouds had come back. But what good were they at night, and where was that rain? It didn't matter. He was distracting himself from the matter at hand. Resisting the urge to turn on his pen light, Bob let his eyes adapt to the dark. It didn't take long for him to be able to pick out shapes. He could see the vague outlines of the nearest 3 cabins, and he could see the vertical pattern of the woods at the edge of the camp. Between 2 of the cabins, a handful of distorted shapes baffled Bob, until he remembered a rustic playground was situated there. Bob saw a small spark of light in the playground area. He froze. Was that Ralpho? What if that was Ralpho using a pen light like Bob's? Bob strained to see in the dark. Then he realized he was looking at the glowing end of a cigarette. Good. Rabbits didn't smoke. Bob contained a burst of laughter. Rabbits didn't smoke. Was Cabin Nutta really making him nuts? Ralpho wasn't a real rabbit. Bob watched the minuscule circle of light. It rose and lowered a couple times. Then Bob realized he could just make out the outline of a man. A man, not a rabbit. Closing the cabin door behind him, Bob stepped off the cabin's porch. He headed across the 100 feet or so from his cabin to the lit cigarette. The early morning air was cool and heavy with the thickly sweet scent of the woods and the fresh scent of recently cut grass. Dew moistened Bob's toes as he walked. Away from his snore-ridden cabin, Bob could hear night sounds more clearly. Crickets were industriously chirping. He also heard the rustle and crack of tree branches bending to the will of the wind that had apparently started blowing during the night. As Bob neared the tiny flicker of light, he heard a man's feet shuffle against rocky ground, and then a loud sigh. "Hello there," Bob called out softly. The tiny light jerked. "Sorry to startle you. I couldn't sleep." Bob listened to a man suck in smoke and then expel it. The smell of menthol made Bob's nostrils twitch. "Me neither," the smoker said unnecessarily. A flashlight clicked on, and the smoker shined a beam of light on his own face. It made the smoker look sinister, especially with smoke pouring out of his nose, but Bob could tell the guy was probably pretty normal looking in the daytime. He had a thick head of light-colored hair, and he had what might be blue eyes. The eyes, though, looked sad. Bob flicked on his penlight and shined it in his own face. He chuckled. "Not our best sides, huh?" The smoker appeared to smile. It was hard to tell. The macabre effects of his flashlight turned the smile into a sneer. "I'm Bob." Bob offered his hand. "Philip." Philip took the last drag of his cigarette and pinched it out between two fingers before taking Bob's hand and shaking it. Bob felt a little intimidated by the pinching a lit cigarette move, but he told himself to grow up. Aiming his light around, he saw that Philip was leaning against the end of the swing set. Bob was tempted to take a seat in one of the swings, but then he'd feel even more like a little boy than he already did. "You signed up for the bunny call, too?" Philip asked. Bob's breathing sputtered like a guttering candle. He had to run his tongue around inside his mouth before he answered. "Yeah." Philip flicked his lighter on and off, then stuffed it into his pocket. "Probably not my best decision." His expression seemed a little severe for the situation, didn't it? "I've been awake most of the night thinking about it," Bob admitted. He looked at his watch. "What's the time?" Philip asked. "It's 5:08, Bob said. "Why doesn't time crawl when things are going right?" Philip asked. Bob didn't answer. What was the point? So he stood in the dark with Philip and listened to the wind. He also listened to the ticking of an imaginary clock. It ticked louder than any real clock Bob had ever heard. Ralpho could show up at any minute. The men listened and waited. Bob's intestines just felt like battling serpents, flailing around inside his belly. Bob was seconds from throwing up, but he managed to get himself under control. The serpent slid back down into his gut, but it didn't stop writhing. "My mom collected stuff," Bob said. Philip shifted at the unexpected words. His back shoved against the swing set. Bob was surprised, too. He didn't know he was going to say out loud what he was thinking about. Since he started, though, he figured he'd finish. It was better than hanging out here waiting for an orange rabbit while his anxiety ate him alive from the inside. Her favorite collectibles were baskets and china teacups. An image of Bob's mother filled his mind. His mom had been very old school and very feminine. She always wore pastel slacks and floral silk blouses, even on house-cleaning day. She always tried to be the perfect wife. She had kind of spoiled Bob, if he was being honest. He'd thought he'd have a life like his dad's. He'd come home from work, put his feet up, read the paper. Talk about culture shock. Not that Wanda wasn't a great wife. Bob remembered he was telling a story. She kept her most prized baskets on top of the hutch in the dining room, and the teacups were on top of the sideboard that was next to the hutch. Bob paused and listened to the sound of the wind. That was the wind, wasn't it? When nothing appeared out of the night, he continued. "One day I thought it would be fun if I could see if I could throw my basketball up into one of her baskets. I have no idea why that seemed like a good idea. I was 9. Philip didn't say anything. The sense of urgency Bob had felt since he'd gotten out of bed suddenly multiplied tenfold. He rushed on with his story. "So I tossed the ball in a perfect arc. I'd been practicing, and it lands on the biggest basket. I'm jumping around like I've won a tournament, making all the crowd noises, whooping and cheering, but then the ball starts to tip the basket, and the basket starts to go over. It happens in super slow motion, like a millionth of an inch per few seconds. Or at least that's how it seems. And then the basket is on its side, and the ball is on its way past the other baskets, and on down the side of the hutch. I can see what's going to happen, and I'm in motion immediately. But there's no way I can stop it. The ball comes down and lands on the sideboard, scattering Mom's teacups, all over the place. All but one of them broke. Mom was devastated." Bob stopped and cleared his throat. "Once I made the decision, the rest of it was out of my control." He shook his head. "I think I made a decision like that today with Bunny Call." A loud half-baying, half-yelping cry sounded in the distance. Bob and Philip both whirled around. Was it the wind, or something else? Philip coughed, cleared his throat, and said in a smoke-abraded voice, "My mom died when I was 5. I hardly remember her. But I remember how my dad was before she died. He was a great dad, taught me how to throw a ball, always showed me what he was working on when he fixed stuff, read me stories at night. But then after Mom died, my dad—" Philip paused when a keening sound sliced through the camp and speared both men. Bob's muscles were taut with fear and dread. Bob didn't think Philip was going to finish his story, but suddenly Philip said, "My dad got lost. He just got lost. He couldn't do anything for me anymore. He was all about himself. He turned into a horrid dad. Philip pushed off the swing set. He powered on his flashlight. Philip turned and looked Bob in the eye. "I've become just like him." Before Bob could respond, Philip turned off his flashlight and walked away. The night plucked him from Bob's reality and deposited him someplace beyond his senses. Bob was left standing alone with more self-knowledge than anyone would ever want to have. "That's enough," Bob said. He was going to stop the bunny call. Bob headed off into the woods, going in the general direction, he thought, of where the last two sounds originated. That same direction as the lodge. Maybe someone would be there, someone who could find Ralpho and cancel the Mackenzie bunny call. It was 100 yards or so to the lodge, but it felt much farther as Bob attempted to follow, using only his small penlight, the gravel-covered path through heavy forest and past darkened cabins. He started at a walk, but he quickly shifted to a jog, hoping he wouldn't trip on a root or an errant ball or an oar. He couldn't afford to waste time. Ralpho wouldn't show up to Cabin Nutta at any minute. For all Bob knew, Ralpho could be there now. When Bob broke through the last stand of trees at the edge of the open area in front of the lodge, his shoulders sagged. The lodge was completely dark. It was so dark it looked abandoned. That was crazy, of course. Someone had to be in there. Bob hesitated in the middle of dew-drenched sloping lawn. Should he pound on the lodge doors and wake someone up? A squall echoed through the trees. Bob whipped around to look back at the path he'd come down. He stopped thinking and simply went into action. Jogging again, he retraced his steps until he was about halfway to his cabin, his family. Then he heard a scuttling sound that froze his intestinal serpents and turned his spine to ice. Was that Ralpho? Bob aimed the narrow beam of his penlight into the underbrush on either side of the path. The pale white light landed on drooping leaves of a wild plant. It seemed to be trembling. Surely Bob was imagining that. Of course he was. The wind was just stirring the slick green leaves. Or was it the wind? The leaves were moving in a direction that didn't make any sense. An abrupt explosion of snaps and crackles stirred up a rustling that seemed to move away at a right angle to the path. Without thinking about the consequences, Bob veered off the path and dove into the thick vegetation. He followed the sounds. Pop, crackle, ting. What was that sound? Bob stopped abruptly, losing his balance. He threw a hand out to catch himself, and he scraped his palm on rough bark. He turned off his penlight. He listened. There it was again. Barely there, a slightly metallic rattle. Was it a cymbal? Trying to make as little noise as possible, Bob started moving again, following the sounds. They moved steadily away from him, heading toward the edge of the camp, heading in the direction of Cabin Nutta. But not necessarily to Cabin Nutta. There were at least 5 other cabins around it. Yeah, keep telling yourself that, Bob thought, as he tracked through the sounds through the forest. He was moving by feel now, afraid to turn on his penlight again. He had this insane idea that Ralpho was messing with him, playing a scary game of hide-and-seek. What was Bob dealing with? Was it a camp counselor with a sense of humor, or an animatronic with its circuits crossed, or something more treacherous than either of those? Bob forced his brain to power down its thinking centers and focus only on keeping his body in motion. He concentrated on where he was putting his feet. He plowed through the forest the way Wanda moved through shoppers in an after-Christmas sale. He had one goal: stop the orange rabbit. He would not be deterred from that goal. But wait. Bob halted next to a massive cedar. He listened, and heard nothing. Absolutely nothing. Had he imagined all the sounds he thought he heard? Or was Ralpho done playing with Bob? What if Ralpho was getting close to Cabin Nutta? What if he was already there? Bob thrashed back to the path, and when he reached it, he turned on his penlight to illuminate his way. Then he ran flat out. Bob hadn't run since he was on the football team in high school. He jogged some, but he never stuck with it. So when he reached the cabin, he could barely breathe. All he could do was open the door and fall inside. Once there, he firmly shut the door and slid to the floor, his legs splayed out in front of him. He heaved to get air into his oxygen-depleted lungs. He was making so much sucking, gasping noise that he was nearly drowning out his family's snores. Nearly, but not quite. The import of that hit him. They were still sleeping. All was well. Bob looked at his watch. It was only 5:25 a.m. Bob frowned. How was that possible? It felt like he'd been running around the forest for an hour at least. Bob shrugged. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he was here, and Ralpho wasn't. The door behind Bob's back vibrated when a knock sounded. Bob whimpered. He stayed very still. Maybe if no one answered the door, Ralpho would go away. Another knock, this one louder. Bob got to his knees. He waited. Another knock, more persistent. Okay, playing possum wasn't going to work. Pretty soon Ralph would be pounding on the door and he'd wake up Bob's whole family. Wasn't that what he was trying to stop? Bob turned, grasped the knob, and opened the door a few inches. He looked out. It was all he could do not to scream. Ralpho had been startling to behold from across the huge lobby in the lodge. Close up, Ralpho was just plain alarming. Taking a half step back, Bob braced one foot behind the door, held the doorknob firmly, and blocked the opening with his body. Bob looked up at Ralpho's face. Yes, up. Too far up. Ralpho was over 6.5 feet tall, just to the top of his head. His ears went up another foot or so. And speaking of his head, it was a disturbingly big head, almost the size of one of those exercise balls Wanda liked to sit on. Bob forced himself not to look away from Ralpho's eyes, even though they were an unsettling bright pink. Ralpho gazed down at Bob and waited. Ralpho. Bob's voice cracked like he was barely older than Tyler. He cleared his throat again and tried. Ralpho, I'd like to respectfully request that we, cancel our bunny call. Ralpho didn't move. I'm sorry you came all the way out here, Bob continued, and I, appreciate your time, but I've decided a bunny call isn't the best thing for our family. Ralpho is immutable. So, like I said, Bob plowed ahead. With due respect, we won't be needing your services. Bob held his breath. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Ralpho slowly nodded, turned, and headed down the steps of Cabin Nutta. Bob shut the door, locked it, and leaned against it, sighing deeply. Tears filled his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been so relieved. It was over. He'd been able to fix his mistake after all. Bob sank to the floor again. He sat and listened to the snores. He made a mental note to record these sounds before they left Campitania. He might start using them to de-stress. Bob? Bob turned his head so fast he smacked it against the door. He heard Wanda shift on the double bed. Where are you? Wanda asked. Over here. Bob turned on his penlight and heaved himself to his feet. Why are you up? I'm not sure. Bob didn't shine his light at Wanda to see how his answer went over. He was hoping she was still mostly asleep. Wanda's brain generally didn't turn on fully until she'd been awake for at least a few hours. Could you aim your light at the bathroom? No need to turn on my light, too. What time is it? Blankets and sheets rustled. The old box springs under the double mattress squeaked. Bob checked his watch again. He aimed his light out in front of Wanda. It's 5:28. The light lit up most of the room, and he could see that she had her sleep mask pushed on top of her head. She didn't look his way, which was a good thing because he had no idea how to explain why he was standing in front of the cabin door. Too early to get up, she said. Absolutely. Bob heard what sounded like shuffling footsteps outside the cabin door. His breath caught, and he tilted his head to listen. Was it just a pine cone blowing across the porch? Maybe that was it. Wanda went into the bathroom and closed the door. No light showed under the door. He heard her doing her thing, but then he heard the shuffling again. Shh, pff, shh, pff, shh, pff. It was too rhythmic to be a pine cone. Was Ralpho back? Bob pressed back against the door. He couldn't have said why. Leaning on the door wouldn't prevent Ralpho from knocking, and if Ralpho knocked while Wanda was awake, the jig was up. Wanda came out of the bathroom, her gaze steady on the illuminated path of Bob's penlight. She didn't even look at him. Going back to sleep, Wanda said. Coming? Be right there, Bob said. I hope, he thought. Outside the door, the sound came closer. Shh, pff, shh, pff, shh, pff. Bob turned into a statue. He had no idea what he should do. Wanda got back in bed. Light? She said. He flicked off his penlight, and he heard her plump up her pillow. She exhaled in contentment. Something thudded softly against the door behind him. The door moved slightly. Bob shoved his back more firmly to the smooth wood. Wanda's snores joined the kid's snores. Next to Bob's hip, the doorknob jiggled. What the heck? Bob jumped back from the door and shined his penlight at the knob. He reached a hand out, preparing to grab the knob, fling the door open and ask Ralpho, or whoever was out there, what he, she, or it thought they were doing. Before he could touch the knob, though, he felt something like a static shock, just a faint charge on the end of his fingertips. Bob knew it was a warning. He just knew it. Opening the door would be a very bad idea. Bob frowned. What? That was ridiculous. He was losing his marbles. Yes, someone was on the outside of the door. Yes, someone was trying the knob. But that someone was either Ralpho or another camper. Bob could handle either. Or could he? A metallic scratching sound came from the door. Bob bent over and listened. Someone was trying to pick the lock. Goosebumps erupted on Bob's bare arms. Ralpho, or someone, was trying to break into the cabin. What should he do? Bob looked around wildly. What did he need? A phone? No phones here. The bell. No, that wouldn't work. The bell was outside. It was outside and it was at the bottom of the porch. Bob would have to get past whoever was trying to break in to get the bell. A lot of good this emergency bell was. A weapon. Bob needed a weapon. He swept the cabin with his light. Of course it held no traditional weapons, no guns, no knives, no swords. This was summer camp, not boot camp. Not even a bat. His kids hadn't signed up for a softball. His light landed on tennis rackets and fishing poles. Bob swallowed down a hysterical giggle when his brain offered up an image of him fighting off an orange rabbit with a tennis racket in one hand and a fishing pole in the other. Bob heard a clink and a click. Well, he had to do something. Grabbing one of the ladder-back chairs tucked under the table, Bob tilted it and shoved it under the doorknob, just in time. The door started to open, but it caught against the chair. Bob stared at the chair and the door, and he held his breath. Something thumped against the door, and the door moved inward an inch, shoving the chair across the smooth wood floor. Bob jammed the chair harder under the knob and held it in place. This stopped the door's movement, but by now it was open 2 inches. Breathing fast, Bob shined his light into the gap. He leaned over to get a better look. The tip of a furry orange paw tried to slide through the opening. Bob jumped back. At the same time, he hissed, "Go away, I said I wanted to cancel the bunny call." Ralpho didn't seem to care what Bob wanted. He moved his paw back and forth in the door opening for several seconds. Bob prodded at Ralpho's paw with his penlight, wanting to push the paw back out through the door. But Ralpho tried to grab the penlight. Bob snatched the light back, then he hit Ralpho's paw with it. The paw wiggled a little, but he didn't leave the opening, so Bob punched Ralpho's paw as hard as he could with his fist. Pain shot through Bob's knuckles, and he saw something dark and moist appear on the orange paw. Before Bob could figure out what he was looking at, though, the paw retreated from the 2-inch space. Bob took a deep breath and let it out. Okay. Maybe Ralpho would go away now. Bob checked the time. It was 5:36. Surely Ralpho would give up and go visit other cabins with standing bunny calls. Bob wondered if he could go back to bed. His eyes felt like they were full of broken glass. How would he take part in camp activities for a full day of no sleep? A whump sounded from under the picture window. Bob whirled in that direction. Ralpho wouldn't try to come through a window, would he? Bob quickly aimed his penlight at the large rectangular glass-covered opening above the table and chairs. He sucked in his breath when his light caught the shadow of a large, misshapen head. "Oh, no," Bob whispered as he leaped over to the window. It was locked, wasn't it? The window started to open. No, apparently it wasn't locked, or it was locked and Ralpho had managed to unlock it, or locks were irrelevant to Ralpho, just as irrelevant as Bob's request that Ralpho go away. The window opened farther, and an orange paw reached through, then an ear. "Why don't you just stand here and watch? That's a good plan, Bob." Bob's sarcastic self-talk made a point. He needed to move, so he did. But as he lunged for one of the tennis rackets leaning against the wall, he cut himself some slack. It was, after all, reasonable to be dumbfounded in the presence of a furry orange intruder. Both of Ralpho's ears and most of an arm were through the window by the time Bob started beating on the ears and arm with the tennis racket. Careful to avoid missing the rabbit and hitting the window, Bob's defensive thwacks were relatively quiet. His family's snores didn't stop. Neither did Ralpho. Apparently impervious to the blows, Ralpho kept reaching into the cabin. "Get out!" Bob whispered. Ralpho didn't respond. Bob looked at Ralpho's paw, which was just a few inches from Bob's chest. The paw was covered in blood. What? Blood? Bob stopped pounding with a tennis racket. He shined his light on Ralpho, whose head was now coming farther into the cabin. Bob stared into Ralpho's disquieting eyes. "Are you okay?" Bob asked. Ralpho stared back at Bob, but he didn't speak. Wasn't this just a guy in a freaky rabbit suit? Ralpho wasn't real, was he? Ralpho's head slid a little farther inside the cabin. Whatever Ralpho was, Bob couldn't let him in, so Bob shifted his grip on the tennis racket. Instead of hitting Ralpho more, he used his racket to shove at Ralpho's encroaching head. Grunting, he pushed against Ralpho with all his might. For a few seconds, Ralpho pushed back. It was like a bizarre tug-of-war in reverse. But Bobo thought about his sleeping family, and that gave him the extra oomph he needed. Ralpho fell back out of the cabin. Bob quickly but quietly closed and locked the window. Realizing he was breathing loudly, he took a few seconds to get control of himself. Blowing out a long, muted breath, he was pleased when he could no longer sound like a train engine. How could Ralpho be bleeding? If Ralpho was a guy in a suit, why would he be willing to get injured to pull off a prank? Up until now, Bob's logical brain had been trying to tell him that the effort he was expending to keep Ralpho out of the cabin was beyond preposterous. Whoever was wearing or running Ralpho was being persistent, yes, but it was probably just some part of the outrageous joke Capitania's staff played on anyone with the audacity to try and stop the Bunny Call. Bob's sense of urgency, but conviction that he was battling a truly dangerous foe, was more than likely all in his head. But a bleeding Ralpho put a serious crimp in Bob's theory. What if Ralpho really did want to get inside the cabin and hurt Bob and his family? Maybe Bob was losing his mind. But then again, maybe not. The window on the left side of the cabin started to slide open. Bob moaned. He'd forgotten Wanda had opened that window. Bob charged over to the window. Just as Ralpho's bleeding orange paw began reaching through the opening, Bob slapped the window closed, catching the intruding paw. The paw bled more heavily, and it moved, reaching. Bob snatched up the tackle box sitting under the window and slammed the paw with the box. The contents of the box clattered, and the noise made Bob pause. The paw curled back toward the window, and Bob opened the window just enough to thrust the paw back outside with the end of the tackle box. He pushed the window closed and locked it. Bob shined his penlight around the cabin again. What would Ralpho do next? Come on, think, Bob admonished himself. Thinking, though, was a bad idea. If he thought, he'd have to free the fact that it was really Ralpho, a very determined Ralpho, willing to bleed to reach his goal, trying to get in the cabin. What else could he want? Bob certainly did not want to think about that. Right now, every one of his instincts was telling him to keep Ralpho out at any cost. This had gone beyond trying to stop Ralpho from scaring his wife and kids. This was about stopping Ralpho, period. Bob couldn't have explained what was going on, even if someone had put a gun to his head and demanded he explain himself, but he just knew there would be horrible consequences if Ralpho got inside the cabin. Bob tilted his head and listened. He realized he had no idea where Ralpho was. Was Ralpho even still outside his window, or had he moved on to a different one? Bob held perfectly still again and listened some more. At first he heard nothing. He checked his watch. It was 5:43. 17 minutes to go, Bob whispered. And one more window Ralpho could get through. Why was Bob just standing there? Outside, the rhythmic shuffling moved past the cabin door. Shh, poof, shh, poof, shh, poof. The sound was moving away from Bob. Ralpho was heading towards the other window, the one right next to the double bed where Wanda slept. Bob knew he had to be sure the next window was locked, but he was rooted to the floor. Shh, poof, shh, poof, shh, poof. Ralpho was almost to the edge of the front porch, about to turn the corner. Bob moved. He ran through the cabin as lightly as he could, passing his sleeping wife and daughter. Just as he reached the window, it started to move. Bob grabbed the edge of the window and tried to close it. Ralpho kept trying to open it. Bob stuffed his penlight in his pocket and used both hands to force the window closed. He concentrated on keeping his breathing even and shallow. He didn't let himself grunt or groan in exertion. He just pushed the window closed while Ralpho pushed the window open. Stalemate. How long did Bob stand there trying to close the window? It felt like hours, maybe days. Bob's muscles began to spasm. It felt like his biceps were filled with liquid fire spreading upward into his shoulders. He wanted to scream in pain and frustration. Outside, faint pre-dawn light was pushing away the blackness. Bob could make out Ralpho's gargantuan head and ears. Bob was just inches from his only adversary. Only window glass separated them. Window glass and Bob's determination to protect his family. Bob closed his eyes and gave his effort everything he had. Suddenly, the window slid shut. The snick of it latching its place seemed impossibly loud. Wanda stirred, but she didn't wake up. Weakly, Bob looked out the window. Then, he dropped his arms and shook them out. They felt like they'd turned into a pair of Cindy's flimsy jump ropes. Stepping away from the bed, Bob wiped the sweat covering his face. He felt a ludicrous sense of accomplishment. A bump and a clatter came from underneath the cabin. Ralpho had moved on. Bob pulled his penlight from his pocket and aimed it at the floor. The trapdoor! Bob ran over to the trapdoor and stood on it. He immediately felt like an imbecile. His weight alone wasn't going to be enough to keep the trapdoor closed, at least not if he was standing. Ralpho could easily throw Bob off balance by opening it. Would sitting on the trapdoor work? Bob sat down on the door. He listened to the bumps under the floor, growing ever closer. The closer they came, the more Bob thought about how big Ralpho was. Bob wasn't a tiny guy, but he was pretty sure whoever was in the Ralpho suit was strong enough to dislodge Bob from a trapdoor. And then what? What could he do? He looked around, grasping for a solution. His gaze landed on the chest of drawers. Jumping up and running to the chest, he gave it a tentative shove. It was heavy, but it slid easily. The only problem was that the sliding sound was noisy. Cindy's snores paused for a second, and then restarted. Bob's gaze darted around the cabin. Think. He spotted the quilt lying, folded up on the end of the trundle bed. He mentally thanked Cindy for playing with it. If she hadn't, he probably wouldn't have noticed it. Grabbing the quilt, he lay it on the ground. Another bump and a scuffle from under the cabin. Ralpho was almost to the trapdoor. Bob tilted the chest toward him, so it leaned on its side. He let it all the way down to the floor on top of the quilt. Then he bent over, grabbed the edge of the quilt, and started dragging the chest toward the trapdoor as fast as he could. The trapdoor started to open. Bob jumped on the door. It closed with a snap that made Bob wince, but the snoring around him continued. He leaned back over and grabbed the quilt's edges, hauling the chest toward him as fast as he could. The trapdoor started to rise under his feet again. Quickly he backed off of it and pulled the chest onto the door. Then he turned the chest onto its back, and he sat on it. The chest started to buck, and Bob felt like he was on some silent, malevolent amusement park ride. Was the combined weight of Bob and the chest of drawers going to be enough? The chest bucked again, and Bob was nearly thrown off. He gripped both sides of the chest and hung on. Bob had never ridden a bull or a mechanical bull, but he wondered if it was like this. His head kept getting yanked around, and he'd have a whiplash soon if Ralpho didn't stop. But Ralpho did stop. Scuffling sounds under the cabin moved away from the trapdoor and toward the outside wall. Bob slumped on the chest. Now was it over? Bob checked his watch. It was 5:56. 4 minutes, just 4 minutes. Bob listened closely to the swishing and tapping sounds under the cabin. Ralpho was almost out from under the building. His whole family was still snoring, but Wanda shifted in the bed. Any of the kids could wake up soon, and Bob didn't want to leave the chest lying in the middle of the floor. After another few seconds of listening, Bob convinced himself Ralpho was no longer under the cabin, so he quickly pulled the chest back to the wall and righted it. He then made a half-hearted attempt to fold the quilt and dropped it on the end of the bed. Then Bob thought about Ralpho's bleeding paws. Did any blood get inside the cabin, like on the tennis racket or the tackle box? Bob decided he didn't want to look. Instead, he trotted to the fridge and pulled off some paper towels from the roll Wanda had put on top. He quickly wiped down both the tennis racket and tackle box. Plus, he wiped down all the windows and the floor beneath each one. Now, wanting very much to climb into bed himself, Bob waited. His instincts were telling him he had to stay alert. But why? The cabin was secure. Ralpho was retreating. A sudden rap drubbed against the back of the cabin. The back of the cabin? What was Ralpho doing there? Nothing was back there. No. Wait. The loft window. Bob's stomach and heart switched places. He'd forgotten all about the loft window. Clamping his penlight in his teeth, Bob climbed the ladder up to the loft as fast as he could, even though every step raised his dread a meter higher. He really didn't want to climb up to the loft at all. If Ralpho was up there, Bob didn't know if he could handle it. But he had to. After all, his boys were also in the loft. When Bob's head reached the top of the ladder, he hesitated. Then he took a deep, shaky breath. He shined his light at the top of the window on the far wall as he peered up into the loft. Bob's light revealed the upper half of Ralpho already through the window. Bob let out a choked cry. Thankfully, his astonishment cut off the sound in his throat, and his boys snored on. Gaping at Ralpho, Bob was momentarily paralyzed. The situation was so thoroughly beyond anything his mind could process that he felt fully shut down. All Bob could do was wait. But he had to move. He had to keep Ralpho away from his family. Why did he just keep gawking? And suddenly, Ralpho paused in his climb through the window. He gazed back at Bob, and neither of them made a sound. Bob trembled, and clutched the loft ladder so hard his hands throbbed. Outside, dawn arrived, and light shined around Ralpho's orange head, making him look, for an instant, like some kind of supernova monster. Bob was superglued to the ladder. He listened to his own uneven breathing. And Ralpho began backing out of the window. Ralpho retreated completely from the cabin. His head dropped down below the level of the window. Then, silence. Silence all around. Bob closed his eyes and dropped his head to the top step of the loft ladder. "Dad?" Abruptly, the cabin was filled with intense white light. The luminous intrusion into his consciousness felt so invasive that Bob blinked several times and tried to figure out where he was. It felt like he'd been transported to another, otherworldly place. Bob squinted. He recognized the wide-eyed face of his sleep-rumbled son. "What are you doing?" Aaron asked. He stood underneath the pull string to the exposed light bulb that now lit up the loft. Everything cascaded back into place. The bunny call, Ralpho, Bob's frenzied determination to stop the threat to his family. "What time is it?" Bob asked. "Huh?" "The time." Aaron picked up his cell phone from his nightstand. Really, the only function their phones had out here was a clock. "It's 6, Aaron said. Tears filled Bob's eyes. "Dad?" Aaron repeated. "What are you doing?" Bob ignored him. Now Tyler was sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "Mama, up!" Cindy's high-pitched voice demanded down below the loft. "Dad, why are you hanging onto the ladder?" Tyler asked. He threw back his covers and shifted to the edge of the bed. Bob didn't know if he could move. He felt like all his muscles had left his body, but he couldn't stay where he was. He didn't have the strength. So, up or down? Up was closer. Bob climbed the rest of the way into the loft. Without answering Tyler's questions, because he didn't know yet how to answer it, Bob collapsed next to Tyler. He motioned for Aaron to join them. Looking at his father as if he had grown a second head, Aaron slowly crossed Tyler's bed. Bob patted the space next to his hip, and Aaron frowned but sat down. Tyler and Aaron exchanged a look. Then Bob reached around the back of the boys' necks and pulled them close. He dropped his arms around their shoulders, and he squeezed them into a long, tight hug. He wanted to say something, but he was too emotional to talk. He just wanted to hold on to his boys, his precious boys, for as long as... "Dad? You're kind of squeezing the life out of us," Tyler said. Bob let up on the hug, but he didn't let them go. He cleared his throat and got his voice to work. "I love you guys," he said. "So much." He looked at both of them in turn. Both boys had creases in their cheeks from the night's sleep. Their eyes were crusty and they had sour morning breath. Bob didn't care. They were his sons. They were perfect. "You know how much I love you, right?" he asked them. Tyler and Aaron looked at each other again. Yeah?" Aaron said. "Yeah," Tyler agreed. "We love you too, Dad," Aaron said. A click came from the cabin's first floor, and more light blasted through the little building. Wanda was up. "Bob, what are you doing up there?" Wanda's scratchy, early morning voice sounded wonderfully normal. "Come on, boys," Bob said. The boys didn't move when Bob got up, but Bob grinned at them before heading down the ladder. What a wonderful morning. It was great to be alive. At the bottom of the ladder, Bob turned toward the double bed and scooped up his daughter from it. "Cindy Lee, my buzzy honeybee," he exclaimed, before buzzing in her little ear. Cindy immediately began giggling hysterically. Then she put her arms straight out to their sides and instructed, "Fly, Daddy, fly." Bob happily picked her up and ran around the room with her, yelling, "Zoom goes the buzzy honeybee, zoom, zoom, buzz, buzz." "Zoom, zoom, buzz, buzz," Cindy repeated it. Then she let loose with a high-pitched squeal of glee. "Bob?" Wanda said. She was standing by the bed in her bright yellow silk pajamas, her hands on her hips. "What?" he asked. "Something weird's going on." "What makes you say that?" Wanda frowned. "I don't know." She shook her head. "I must have been having a strange dream." Cindy squealed again. Wanda looked at her daughter and at Bob. Her mouth dropped open and her eyes widened. The bright light in the cabin brought out the reddest strands in Wanda's hair. Bob couldn't remember her ever being more beautiful. He flew his buzzy honeybee over to his wife, and he engulfed both wife and daughter in a long, tight hug. "I love you, I love you, I love you," he declared, while Cindy said, "Buzz, buzz," and Wanda said, "What's going on?" Bob didn't answer her. He just squeezed. "Be skished," Cindy said. "Ow." Bob released them. He looked at their gorgeous faces, flushed and smiling. Admittedly, Wanda's smile was tentative, and it was mixed with what appeared to be confusion, but she was smiling. "Daddy, pee-pee," Cindy said. Bob set his daughter down. Wanda took Cindy's hand and led her into the bathroom. The second Wanda and Cindy were in the bathroom, Bob looked around the cabin, checking his blood cleanup. He didn't see anything he'd missed. And what did he do about the paper towels he used? He checked his pockets and felt them there, but he didn't pull them out because Aaron and Tyler were coming down the ladder. Putting Ralpho out of his mind, Bob hugged his boys again. They tolerated the hugs for a few seconds, and Tyler announced, "I'm hungry." The bathroom door opened. Cindy, her arms straight out from her sides, started buzzing again. Bob reached out and grabbed Wanda by the hand to pull her close. "It's a beautiful day, and we're all together, and we have lots to do today," he said, spinning Wanda into a dance around the cabin. Wanda laughed. "Who are you, and what have you done with my husband?" Then she gave up and allowed him to sweep her up into the dance. Heading to breakfast at the main lodge, Cindy skipped ahead, but Bob held tight to Wanda's hand. The sun was already ascending into a brilliant blue sky. The evergreens' boughs were bright green in the morning light, and they seemed to be reaching toward that sky, as if in celebration of the new day. Chickadees played in the forest undergrowth. Their calls mixed with the cries of the western bluebirds Bob could see flating through the higher tree branches. A woodpecker added a rat-a-tat from a tree just out of view. On a low-hanging branch near the trail, a chipmunk chattered, sprick, 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 as it fluffed its tail. Bob felt like he and everything around him had been cartooned. It all felt too colorful, too cheerful, too, well, cartoony. After everything that had happened the night before, he wouldn't have been surprised if the families around him broke into song. Campetenia was hopping this morning, as everyone was heading to the lodge for breakfast. Kids were running and playing as they went. Aaron and Tyler raced off to join some new friends in a game that involved a lot of shouting. Today, all the activity didn't bother Bob. He was still riding the high of his profound relief. "I take it you've decided this place isn't too bad?" Wanda asked. Bob grinned at her. "There are worse places." Much worse, Bob thought, 15 minutes later as he sat at the table with his family, eating his way through some of the thickest, tastiest pancakes he'd ever known. "Wow, what's in these?" he asked one of the camp employees who came by to top off his coffee. The perky, gray-haired woman leaned over and whispered, "The secret is cinnamon and vanilla, but don't tell anyone I told you." She grinned and bustled off. Breakfast was being served in the main dining room, which, like the main lobby of the lodge, had a vaulted log ceiling and golden log walls. Bob appreciated that the room was filled with dozens of round tables, so families could eat together instead of being forced to join everyone else at long, communal tables. The only long table was the one at the front of the room, and it seemed to be reserved for Campetenia staff. Bob took another bite and watched his kids eat. Aaron and Tyler were stuffing as many pancakes as they could, acting like they'd never have another chance to eat, ever. Cindy had both pancake and syrup smeared adorably all over her face. Around them, dozens of conversations filled the room with a lively hum that blended with the clinks and clatters of silverware and stoneware. The air was sweet with the aroma of maple and butter. Excuse me, excuse me." The loud tink-tink-tink of a spoon hitting the side of a glass lowered the decibel level in the room part way. "Could I have your attention, everyone?" Bob and his family, and most of the other diners, looked toward the staff table. In the middle of it, a tall, tanned man with a beard waved at everyone. "Over here," he called. Bob recognized him from the picnic and the campfire the night before. Talking died down. A few more rustlings and murmurings gave way to silence. Everyone looked at the man. "Remember me from last night? I'm Evan, the owner of Campetenia, and your host. I hope everyone had a good first night." Bob tensed, but kept a smile on his face. Most everyone else cheered. Good, everyone," Evan said. "Okay, a few announcements." Bob prepared to zone out. He figured Wanda would let him know whatever he needed to know. "First, regarding the Bunny Call," Evan said. Every cell in Bob's body went on high alert. He tuned in. "My apologies to those who signed up for a Bunny Call," Evan said. They should apologize, Bob thought. The Bunny Call couldn't be done this morning because the counselor who usually does Bunny Calls overslept. Ralpho wasn't able to make his rounds today. Bob stared at Evan. "These are really great pancakes," Wanda said. "Aren't they, Bob?" Shit. What? Oh, no. Oh, no. Okay, well, that was, I didn't, wow, okay, that's a bit concerning. But you know what? In the end, everything turned out alright. So, who knows what that thing was, but in the end, everything is all good, So, that was such a good story. Definitely one of my favorites so far. That was really good. I can see some people not liking all the character stuff that happened at the beginning. It went on for like half the story. But once it gets going, it really gets going. Definitely, I'll have to think about it, but that was probably one of my favorite stories so far, just because of that ending alone. Thank you guys for listening. I'll be doing the second story next, hopefully very soon, and I'll see you guys next time. Let me know what you think in the comments, if you have any theories. Believe it or not, I do read those comments. And you know what? If you made it this far, why not subscribe so you know when the next part comes out? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.